an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. Look at that. The 10th day of October already. Thanksgiving weekend in the rearview mirror in this part of the world. I'd laugh on the weekend. We find it necessary to say Happy Thanksgiving, brackets, in Canada. I mean, really, are we that insecure? Having to explain ourselves for Thanksgiving. Seriously. If only that were the biggest issue on the table today, you know? Coming back after a long holiday weekend. Plan to talk about, you know, the dinner that we had with the kids and Elliot making his first appearance in the house. He was here for dinner along with big brother James, and they brought their parents with them. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law got to meet, and it was nice, right? Got to hang around with a couple of music buddies as well. So, spent some time jamming and working on some tunes. Just one of those things I haven't had an opportunity to do lately. Might even have talked about getting all set and wound up because hockey season, NHL, starts tonight. Looking forward to the Leafs tomorrow. Watched a bit of baseball, but no, none of that. None of that gets talked about today. Here we are with headlines full of protests, demonstrations, rallies right across the country, and all eyes on the Middle East. And if, you know, you're like me, you went, what? When the news broke on Saturday morning. So there is only one story really to talk about today. And we are going to get to that. Israel, Hamas at war. Well, as I sit here, I'm watching I've got the CNN up on the screen here, and it doesn't seem to matter what time of day, what network you're watching. This is the thing that takes up all the oxygen, and for all the right reasons. What's going on in the Middle East, and it was one of those things I think that really turned some heads, surprised people on so many levels. Even Saturday morning, just having a coffee, my wife and I are, you know, thumbing our way through the newspapers, and Anne looks up from her phone and says, "Israel's at war." I said, "What?" It just sounds like, you know, kind of rhetoric, but quickly you dive into what's going on, and the attacks by Hamas on Saturday were just the beginning of what we're seeing now, and the end in sight, I'm not quite sure if there is one. But I don't have the expertise or insight on that, so that's why we've invited Phil Gurski to join us, President and CEO at Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. I imagine you've been busy this weekend.
Yeah, like you, awoke to this information and thinking, wow, yeah, I'm used to Hamas attacks in Israel. They've been doing it for the past 40 years or so. But to see something on this scale, and I'm hearing now, as of this is Tuesday morning, I think the casualty count in Israel is over 700. This is unprecedented in modern Israeli history. And I think, like you, it's like, oh my God, this is different. This is not your garden variety cross-border terrorist attack, lone actor, suicide bomber, whatever. This is more planned, it's more sophisticated, it's more coordinated, and it's something that I think a lot of people, like your wife and yourself included, are surprised. Like, how could this happen now in 2023?
Well, and that is sort of the overarching question, and I appreciate why on the ground we're not talking about that yet, because literally the Middle East is on fire right now. But at the same time, at some point, there has to be brains that are devoting energy to this and thinking, how the hell did this happen in plain view? To your point, incursions are one thing. This is no longer an incursion. This was a sophisticated, multi-pronged attack that was highly planned. It didn't just happen overnight. So clearly there were things going on the ground in Gaza that who wasn't paying attention here?
Yeah, as you said, those are questions everybody's asking, and the phrase that I'm hearing across the board is intelligence failure. Now, as you can appreciate, as somebody who spent 32 years in intelligence, I get a little bit squirmy when people point fingers at us and say, you guys screwed up. But clearly, the Israelis did miss something. And there's all kinds of reasons why that could have happened. I read some interesting analysis this morning in The Economist that the senior leadership of Hamas didn't use their cell phones over the past little while because, of course, Israel has incredible SIGINT, so it's the signals intelligence capability. You wonder about Israel's human sources into Hamas because you've got to assume that Hamas is riddled with Israeli human sources by Shin Bet, which is their security service, internal security service, or your military intelligence. And I don't know, Dave. It's such a complicated question that requires a complicated answer. Unfortunately, people want an easy answer to this. But I think there are other elements at play here. You may be aware the Netanyahu government has been under a lot of pressure lately within Israel for its own actions with the Supreme Court. The fact that it's by far the most right-wing Israeli government in history, with people who are, let's face it, they're Jewish extremists within the Israeli government, doing all kinds of nasty stuff in the West Bank with settlements and settlers and all this kind of stuff. So, again, I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody. I'm just trying to say that when something of this scale happens, it's not just the intelligence agency screwed up. My own sort of reservations and sensitivities notwithstanding. It's a much more complicated answer to that question, I think.
Well, and therein lies the problem, right? This is an issue where it seems as though violence, extreme violence, bad. Okay, there's the binary argument. As soon as we get past that, we have to talk about this in very subtle and nuanced language because the history is just layered upon layer upon layer. And every time someone brings up a point, well, rightly or wrongly, someone else will dig a little deeper into the history and say, yeah, except, and there's the yeah, butism that goes on all the time. So that complicates things. And then on the other hand, to criticize the Israeli government can, in some circles, is considered anti-Semitic. That opens up a whole new problem in terms of how do we solve or get to the anywhere near solution. And I say that understanding how naive that sounds. But I agree. It's the subtleties around this that make it all the more difficult to come to terms with.
And people hate subtleties and they hate nuance. And you're absolutely right, Dave. I've been writing for years now. I had a whole chapter on Jewish extremism in a recent book I wrote, When Religions Kill. These people are as nasty as the jihadis in some ways when it comes to killing Arabs and killing Muslims and taking territory. And God says this. An old friend of mine once said something really interesting. He says, whenever you put God into an equation, the equation is unsolvable. Like if side A thinks they have God on their side and side B thinks they have another God on their side, there's not going to be any resolution to this. The other lesson for this, I think, is that, I've heard reports that within Israel, they thought Hamas had, if not been defeated, had been largely marginalized over the past couple of years and was no longer interested in terrorist attacks, no longer interested in mass incursions into Israel. So that was a failure of imagination, which, of course, 9/11 often, that label's been applied to the American government for 9/11. But I think there's a bigger issue here, and it's something that I'm going to be writing about soon, is that we fool ourselves if we think that a particular terrorist group can ever be really defeated. As long as there's enough people still around with the ideology that they want to accomplish X, Y, or Z, you can't defeat them unless you kill them all. And then when you kill them all, you create more martyrs, which brings more people to the cause. So I think, you rightly say that we have to dig deeper into this thing. And we have to ask some uncomfortable questions, whether it's of the Israeli intelligence or the Israeli government or Israeli society or on the Palestinian side. Who was standing up to Hamas on the Gaza Strip saying, hey, guys, I don't think you should be doing this. We're going to pay the price. And we're already seeing civilians pay the price in the Gaza Strip. But humans want black and white answers to questions that are 50 shades of gray. And no, that's not an allusion to a book on sexuality, but life is 50 shades of gray, and I think our answers have to account for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You start to play this chess game, and I keep hearing, well, Iran's behind this. But I think you might have cited a piece from The Economist over the weekend and looking into it. Or anyway, I was reading something in The Economist that said, it's easy to say that because it's low-hanging fruit in the geopolitical picture. But historically, based on their reporting, Iran hasn't really come to the rescue of the Palestinians historically. So, if Iran's involved, it's for some other reason. And again, we're back to that nuanced discussion about what exactly are they trying to achieve here. I understand they just like to see Israel wiped off the map, and that's kind of the common goal. But it's not necessarily anything they're doing necessarily is to benefit the Palestinians per se.
No, you're absolutely right. And you may not be aware, but I was actually an Iranian analyst for 20 years. When I started in signals intelligence, I acquired Farsi, taught myself Farsi. I studied Iranian history. I was very well versed on Iran. And no, Iran is not a international do-gooder. Let's not mince words here. But I think that they are an easy target because they have, in fact, supported Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and other groups for going on half a century now, since the revolution in 79. And therefore, to point fingers at Iran, it's a no-brainer. Well, Iran has to have been behind this. And there's no question Iran is happy at what has happened in Israel because Hamas is a client of theirs. But whether they were behind it, financed it, put them up to it, helped them operationally, I really have no idea. And I also know historically that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah say to Iran, thank you very much for your support. Now piss off. We're going to do things according to our schedule, not according to yours. So again, it's not as easy as that. David, there's a reason why I haven't been an Israel-Palestinian specialist. It's because it is so goddamn complicated. It's been going on forever. And to be perfectly honest, I don't see a solution to this. There were the infamous Oslo Accords back in 94. Which was supposed to be the beginning of the end of the conflict, a Palestinian homeland. Well, that's gone nowhere. Terrorism is still on the rise. We've got the rise of the far right in Israel. And was it Golda Meir or someone famously said, no, a pox on both their houses. And both countries do have blame here. Again, and this is not being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, but there have been mistakes made on both sides. And this is why we are where we are in, early October of 2023.
I want to get to the what's next in a second, but one of the things that I haven't heard discussed, and it occurred to me that this is an intelligence question that on the part of Hamas. How much do you suppose they're paying attention to what's going on in the U.S. Congress, where right now they don't have a speaker, they can't pass legislation? If the government wanted to do anything meaningful in terms of providing aid, support, financial, military, whatever it might be for Israel, they need to get their house in order. So there was a real opportunity there, as small as that window might have been. How much do you suppose that played into any of this?
It's a great question. It certainly is possible. and you raise a really good point that, we here in the West collectively are in a heap of hurt. We're supporting Ukraine over its invasion of Russia, and there have been voices countering that. People like, Donald Trump says if he gets reelected, he's going to drop Ukraine in a heartbeat. We've got European nations pushing back. Well, do we really want to be supporting Ukraine indefinitely because the war will go on for a long time? You have the resignation of the speaker in the United States. You have here in Canada, it's been a complete dog's breakfast of screw-ups over the past couple of months, whether it's Chinese intelligence monitoring or influencing our elections in 2019, 2021, the whole speaker issue, the alleged Indian assassination of a Sikh activist / terrorist on our soil. So I've read a lot of analysis lately that, the West is kind of ebbing in terms of its influence and its ability to shape events internationally, especially the Americans. Again, I would take that with a grain of salt. Definitely things aren't great as of late. I wouldn't, necessarily sign up and say as a consequence, it's going to be Russia, China, India running the world from now on. I don't think it's easy as that. But I think there has been a lot of issues of late. We're just coming out of COVID still. The economy has been like a roller coaster with inflation up and down, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that as humans, we can only look at so many things simultaneously. And, the oxygen in the room has been taken out by Russia, Ukraine for the past almost 2 years now. And I think there are groups that maybe, and again, it's a possibility, groups like Hamas saying, well, guess what? No one's looking at us right now. because they're all looking over their squirrel kind of moment. And maybe that's why they decided to do it when they did. And maybe they're also aware of the turmoil within Israel, the Supreme Court issue, the fact that Netanyahu has been charged with all kinds of corruption over the past couple of years. And so he's got a government that's very, very tenuous at best. So, if you are a terrorist group and you're looking for the best possible opportunity to do something, maybe Hamas kind of, won the gold medal in this regard, because look what they achieved in the matter of a couple of hours.
Well, the other part of it is, and you bring up a good point, we talk about the stability and sort of the behavior of our governments here in North America, and that's one thing. But you don't have to be a student of the Middle East to know that there's no such thing necessarily as a stable government in Israel. That could change tomorrow. I mean, I say that without exaggeration. I mean, if something happened within the government of Israel, there may well be, and I think it's highly likely, may well be the need for a new coalition to run the country. All of a sudden, that's a distraction, just right there in the center of it all.
I think few people recognize that most Israeli governments, in fact, if not all, are in fact coalitions of multiple parties, because no one party, even over the last series of elections, has been able to mount an actual majority. There's so many different parties within Israel. We here in Canada, of course, are used to, it's pretty well they're liberal or conservative. The NDP is an afterthought. The Bloc in Quebec, the Green Party, they barely exist. But normally we go from one majority to another, or in this case, a minority under the Liberals. In Israel, it really is the proverbial dog's breakfast of parties. And the Netanyahu government, rightly or wrongly recently, has decided to bring into the fold a whole bunch of very xenophobic, hateful parties of the far right to support its own coalition. And, Dave, when things like this happen, heads have to roll. Now, I think the immediate finger pointing is at Israeli intelligence. So Shin Bet, the internal service, maybe Mossad, the external service, military intelligence. But the ultimate, as was it Truman said, the buck stops here. The ultimate responsibility is Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. So does that government fall as a consequence? I don't know. He's going to be able to ride the wave of support for the next little while because of the enormity of the attack. But once Israel gets the upper hand, which it will, it has the military superiority to do so, Israelis will be asking those really tough questions like, okay, hey, Benjamin, this happened on your watch. You can't blame somebody else for this. This was your government that failed to prevent this attack. And as a consequence, you have to pay for it. And if that happens, then Israel gets thrown into another election with another dog's breakfast of coalition parties. Will it be, the far left will win this time? I mean, who knows? The one thing that we know that wars do is they concentrate people's attentions for a period of time. But once that starts to ease off, then people start asking the more difficult questions.
Yeah, I mean, here, and again, looking at North America, particularly the United States, if you're a wartime president, you seem to have some momentum or juice in the polls and that sort of thing. Not necessarily the case in Israel. Take me back to Saturday morning, and I'm just curious to your understanding of how that unfolded, because the early reports were they were knocking down walls with bulldozers and trucks. I mean, if it was that easy to breach, again, I might let's get past the intelligence issue. The whole idea that this was ripe for the picking.
Again, so what I've been hearing from news sources like The Economist, which, by the way, I trust as a legitimate news source, it's one of the best in the world as far as I'm concerned. I've been reading The Economist for going on 50 years now, and I'm a big believer in the quality of their reporting. It was a failure in the sense that, movement was seen, whether it's bulldozers or pickup trucks or whatever, that movement was seen near the border, and for some reason that remains unfathomable as of this Tuesday in October, it wasn't seen as a threat. I'm not sure what they would have seen it as. Construction? Would they seen it as a parade? I really have no idea. So Israel rightfully vaunts what they call the Iron Dome, which is this incredible air defense system that is able to essentially shoot down most missiles, rockets, whatever you want to call them, that Hamas or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad fires into Israel from Palestinian or Lebanese territory. But what I've read too is also that at the southern border with Gaza, because there was the assumption that Hamas was not interested in carrying out terrorist attacks, that maybe the personnel assigned to that area of Israel was less than optimal. Not only that, but you're talking reservists. You're talking about people who aren't the sort of seasoned veterans in the Israeli military who would perhaps be in a better position to understand what's going on, appreciate the significance of it, and react more forcefully when it happened. But certainly, and I'm sure, Dave, you've seen the same reports that I have. I mean, basically, Hamas operatives basically punched through this fence like it was cellophane.
Yeah.
And then they end up attacking that concert, et cetera, taking hostages and killing people. This was done in plain sight. You're probably familiar with tunnels that are being dug all the time, especially from Gaza. And these tunnels are always discovered and they're blocked up and all that kind of stuff. These weren't tunnels. This was an above ground, open air, public demonstration of force that the Israelis watched as it was unfolding. So, yeah, great question as to why something wasn't done earlier. But I think there's a number of factors that I already cited that may account for why they were so inept in their response.
We've talked about sort of Hamas being opportunistic and, looking at what's going on around the world. But at some point, there was this whole sense, and I read some analysis on the weekend that suggested that, Hamas was actually keeping the Palestinians, in their corner, so to speak. But around them now, you've got Israel making treaties and agreements with Arab nations in the region and not really paying any attention to the plight of the Palestinians. And there's a lot of criticism about the state of living in Gaza, for example, and, Israel not doing anything to support them. There's a blockade there. And, again, that's one of those self-inflicted wounds in as much as it's a blockade, not because of the Palestinians, but because Hamas controls the region and their terrorist group. So Egypt doesn't want to be involved with them and so on. But when we see Israel turning its attentions diplomatically and having some success with agreements with other Arab nations and ignoring the Palestinians, you got to wonder then at some point there was a fire brewing right there that maybe, in fact, again, lit the fuse under Hamas to say this is time.
Look, when it comes to the Arab world, first of all, the term Arab world really shouldn't be used because there's no Arab world. There's no consensus amongst Middle Eastern, North African states. The only commonality is Islam and, to a large extent, the use of Arabic. But even there, the linguist in me knows there's at least 6 or 7 varieties of Arabic that are completely mutually unintelligible when it comes to languages. There is no unanimity in the Arab world, Middle Eastern world when it comes to Palestine. In fact, there are many that say they pay lip service to the Palestinians. So we have to, call for an independent Palestine. We have to call for the rights of the Palestinians because that's simply the right thing to do. But when push comes to shove, they don't really give a rat's ass about the Palestinians. The average person does, but governments certainly don't. And this is why you've had the Abraham Accords. This is why you have the Saudi crown prince in waiting, MBS, pondering the possibility of full relations with Israel. So that's happening at a completely different level. And you're absolutely right. The Palestinians are relegated to the background yet again. Look, I have no issues with Israel keeping an eye on Hamas and PIJ and Hezbollah and other people that espouse terrorism. But the fact remains is that you've got X number of millions of Palestinians who live in abject poverty. You've got Israeli religious extremists taking territory from under their feet, establishing illegal settlements, which the government then recognizes by essentially annexing the land in the West Bank. And it's no wonder that the Palestinians they've lost their support from the so-called Arab state. Israel doesn't give a shit about them. Nobody seems to care. So I'm not saying I support Hamas. Of course I don't. I can never support a terrorist group, but I can understand why people say, well, at least Hamas is sticking up for us. Mm-hmm. At least Hamas is doing something for us, and maybe that's why they did what they did when they did it, and why they're going to get. We've seen demonstrations here in Canada, Dave, in Toronto, for the Palestinians, and that the feelings are strong because Palestine has been ignored for far too long, and part of that's Israel's fault, part of it's our fault, part of it's the Arab world's fault. But the bottom line is that Palestinians are saying, look, we need to do something to get people's attention again because we're not doing very well right now.
Next steps don't seem to be all that optimistic. I heard somebody describe it today as that we're not even close to a solution here. We're still in the escalation phase of all of this. So it's going to get a lot worse than we've seen over the last couple of days. And it would seem that most are agreeing that the only way, and I think Netanyahu himself has said so, they're going to be on the ground and they're going to go into Gaza. Boy, that has got jeopardy written all over it, beyond the region if that happens.
1,000%. There's nothing worse than occupation, because an occupation is a daily reminder that there's somebody else on your territory that doesn't like you, doesn't trust you to run your own affairs, and is going to do things that aren't in your favor. Look at Israel abandoned Gaza. I forget what year it was. Like I said, this is all becoming a blur now because it's happened so often. But for Israel to go back now, there's no question they have to go into Gaza right now, find Hamas and kill them because they're terrorists, and I don't have an issue with that. The problem is twofold. One is that a lot of civilians are going to die at the same time, creating martyrs for the cause. And secondly, if Israel decides that they can't abandon Gaza because Hamas will simply trickle back in once the war is over, the current military action, we're going to be in the same situation a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. But if Israel decides to go back into Gaza and stay there, then you create the same issues that were created, ever since the 67 war, when they occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where you start pissing off the locals, which creates, I think, fodder for the cause. And that's what feeds terrorism in the first place, is this belief that you're being beset upon by somebody, and the only way to fight back is through the use of violence. So, again, I go back to what I said earlier. I mean, I don't follow Israel-Palestine very closely because it's so goddamn frustrating. And there simply is no solution to this that I've come across that is going to last any amount of time. This war will end, Dave. And Israel will triumph because of their military superiority. But if anybody thinks that this is the nail in the Hamas's coffin, look at your history, because it sure as heck wasn't the nail in the Hamas coffin 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And, you and I, if we're still alive 20 years from now, might be doing another podcast about another Israeli incursion into the Gaza Strip under very similar circumstances. So I normally tend to be an optimistic person. I try to be anyhow. But it's hard to feel optimistic when it comes to anything regarding Israel and Palestine.
Well, and when you
say differently,
yeah, and I hear you. And when you watch this unfold, we're already looking at Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, and determining that the world is a much more dangerous place because of that. It got exponentially more dangerous in the last 4 days.
I hate to say it, and maybe I shouldn't, because if it happens, I'll be accused of causing it. What a great time for China to invade Taiwan.
Right. I mean, we talk about opportunities, and people want, that squirrel
Everybody's
factor.
eyes are turned
Exactly.
elsewhere.
So all of a sudden, then, again, the level of distraction and trying to pay attention on so many fronts. And again, you pointed it out here in Canada. We've got Chinese influence, interference. We've got the poor relations with India right now. We've got our own thing going on. And all of a sudden now, and we're trying to support what's going on in Ukraine, and it's blowing up in the Middle East. Interesting that the statement from 5 of the G7 countries condemning the Hamas violence and the terrorism, and they use that word. Canada didn't sign on to that, or it seemed to be an odd thing. Now, having said that, I think Ottawa pretty much reiterated the same tone and sentiment in their official statement, but they weren't a signatory to that group.
The Prime Minister has since come out and condemned Hamas as a terrorist group, so kudos to him. But there's a bigger issue here, Dave. And I'm hearing from a lot of my sources. There's a lot of our allies, either within NATO or the so-called Five Eyes, the Americans, the Brits, the New Zealanders, Australians, and ourselves on the intelligence level, beginning to ask some serious questions about Canada's, membership in these clubs. We're not pulling our weight. We're not pulling our weight on the defense file. Trudeau admitted publicly he has no intention of ever remotely meeting the 2% NATO minimum floor for defense spending. We've got $1 billion in cuts in defense. I mean, a lot of our traditional allies are asking us, like, what's happening north of the border? We're not the partner we used to be. We're almost becoming an afterthought, and that's not good. I think that we can pull our weight to an extent, But I think that our traditional partners are really having serious questions about, where we stand on certain issues. And that's not good for us. I mean, speaking strictly from an intelligence perspective, when the Prime Minister rises in the House and says he has intelligence from a Five Eyes partner pointing out India had a role in the assassination of Mr. Nijjar in BC, he just exposed an intelligence source in Parliament, and that came from a partner. I sure as shit hoped he got, unauthorized okay. It was probably American SIGINT or whatever it was, that he was going to go up and disclose this publicly, because the intelligence sources that are disclosed disappear. Whether they're human sources or signal sources doesn't matter. And for a prime minister to take that move for whatever reasons he did, and I'm not going to try to guess as to why he would have done that on the day he did it. Is it a coincidence it's just after he got back from India and he was given a scolding by President Modi about, Sikh activism here in Canada? I really have no idea. But when you take an ally's intelligence and you parade it in the public domain, that ain't good. And it's just one more sign that maybe Canada doesn't understand the rules of the game anymore. And this is why we're not being taken very seriously.
Phil, it's great to have your insights on this. Thanks for
Sorry
doing
for
this.
negativity. But
No. Hey, listen, man. It's just one of those things. I think it's beyond negativity. I mean, I think there's a harsh reality here that takes us out of our comfort zone, literally. And it's a harder conversation to have around the Middle East than it is to have Ukraine, Russia. There's a bad guy, there's a good guy, and it's easy. It's binary. Not the case in the Middle East. And for that reason, I think, we need to be probably more vocal in how we talk about it, but be prepared for the blowback, because the historic emotion, which in many cases, as you point out, is legitimate. The response on both sides is legitimate. Boy, it's hard to carve through that deep history, and that's what we're fighting right now.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, sir. Anytime.
Yeah, Phil alluded to it. He spent time working with the intelligence agencies here in Canada. I mean, he just throws phrases around. Oh, yeah, I was the guy that did that after 9/11. I wrote the book on Al-Qaeda, So his insights are pretty interesting, and to the point where, he talks about, I would not want to be involved in any analysis that involved Israel-Palestine, Israel-Palestinians, Israelis-Palestinians. I mean, the language, again, around the whole thing becomes contentious. And, I don't necessarily disagree with him. Where do you find a solution in all that going on? So, and if you want to check out his, you should just go to his LinkedIn page. He's got a lot of fairly extensive detail around some of the work that he's doing. He's the CEO at Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. And he's got quite, he sounds like he's an unassuming guy. And I guess maybe that's what makes him a good intelligence guy, right? Just kind of laid back, not a whole lot of emotion in what he was talking about, looks at it analytically, but understands where the landmines are, even when you are trying to offer some level of context. And therein lies the real challenge around this. So, all right, that'll do it for us here on a Tuesday, October the 10th. It's Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. And tomorrow we're going to feature an interview I did with the folks at Daily Bread Food Bank. And it's part of the limited series that's rolling out right now, all about the Canada Disability Benefit Act that was passed into legislation, royal assent, back at the end of June. And now where? And now what? Here we are. And again, you talk about distractions in Ottawa. This is something that's happening right now in this country that needs full, undivided attention of the government. Here's hoping that events beyond our borders don't necessarily distract from what's going on there. That's tomorrow, coming up right here on Now and Next for Story Studio Network. Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.